Investigation 4, Mono Lake. Students use Mono Lake, an important alkaline lake, as a simple ecosystem case study. They study the functional roles of population to construct a food web. Student learning outcomes research the functional roles of organisms in an ecosystem, use data to construct feeding relationships, diagramming, and explaining food chains and food webs in notebooks. Investigation 4 has several parts. Part 2 has several sessions, as there are a number of major topics that need to be covered. Getting started. Remember, behind each tab for an investigation is your course overview, the goals of the investigation, the objectives, science content, conducting investigations, and building explanations. For each part of the investigation, you are given a synopsis of the lesson, objectives for each part of the investigation, assessment tools, ideas, and materials, preparation instructions for what to do, step-by-step instructions for teaching the lesson, media, reading, CD-ROMs, simulation, etc., as well as extensions for the activity. Investigation 4, Part 1, A Visit to Mono Lake. Review the definition of ecosystem with students. An ecosystem is a dynamic, functional unit of the natural world. Remember, you've already given students the definition of ecosystem in Investigation 2. The purpose for putting it here is so that the word dynamic gets highlighted. It is important to stop and discuss this word, as it helps to define an ecosystem as a functional unit. Introduce the Mono Lake. A good way to start a study of an ecosystem like Mono Lake is to take a field trip to the site. Because Mono Lake is too far away for a real visit, we can substitute a video field trip for a real one. Use the map of the United States to show students where Mono Lake is located. Tell students that Mono Lake is an alkaline ecosystem. Be sure to discuss the meaning of alkaline. Before viewing the video of Ice and Fire, a portrait of the Mono Basin, distribute and review the student sheet, thinking about Mono Lake. As you watch the video, watch and listen for information that defines the Mono Lake ecosystem. Try to determine the issues that have brought attention to this desolate place. Tell students that after viewing the video, they will answer and discuss questions related to the organisms and abiotic factors in the ecosystem. Part 2, Mono Lake Food Web, Session 1. Again, define ecosystem. This time, focus on the clauses of the definition of an ecosystem as the interaction between the biotic and abiotic factors. Record the word interaction on the board and have students review their responses to the Thinking About Mono Lake sheet. And identify areas of interactions between organisms and organisms with the physical environment. From this discussion, you can focus on one interaction in particular, feeding relationships. Using organism cards to challenge students to learn more about the organisms and to start to work on identifying feeding relationships within the Mono Lake ecosystem. Show students a deck of the Mono Lake organism cards and tell them that some of the important organisms in a Mono Lake ecosystem are featured on the cards, one organism to a card. Have them read the cards to become familiar with the organisms and their natural history. Then organize the cards on the table, picture side up. Draw arrows on paper strips. Use them to show feeding relationships between organisms. Every organism should be included in the feeding relationship project. If an organism is involved in two or more feeding relationships, all the relationships should be indicated with arrows. It is very important to help students understand the importance of the direction that the arrow is pointing in. The direction of the arrow is extremely important in showing the feeding relationship between organisms. The arrow goes from the organism that gets eaten, pointing to the organism that does the eating. For instance, the fly is eaten by the spider. So the arrow will point towards the spider. As students are working on the feeding relationship project, please monitor their progress. Sometimes you might need to guide students in getting through the project if they become stalled. So some suggested questions are, what does arrow direction indicate about which organism eats another? Does this organism eat only that one? Is this organism eaten only by that one? Which organism is used as a food source by most other organisms in this ecosystem? In session 2 of the Mono Lake Food Web, we're going to introduce the food chain. So we tell students that many organisms survive by eating other organisms, and the benefits of the food eaten by one organism can then move to another organism and another as each one is eaten. The path that food takes from one organism to another organism is called a food chain. An example here from the Mono Lake organisms, planktonic algae is eaten by the brine shrimp, which is eaten by the California gull, which is eaten by the coyote. So the food that is eaten by each organism, some of it gets passed on to the next organism. Many organisms in the feeding relationships are connected with more than one arrow. When you connect all the organisms with arrows, the arrows cross each other in a complex way. This shows all the feeding relationships in an ecosystem. This is called a food web. Review the definition of organisms. Tell students that there are 3 types of organisms: producers, or organisms that use the sun's energy to make their own food, along with other factors. Consumers are organisms that eat other organisms. Decomposers are organisms that feed on dead organisms. Spend a little bit more time talking about consumers. Tell students that there are different levels that consumers eat from, and that the organisms that eat from the different levels are also defined by what they eat. We will talk more about that part of the consumer category in the next investigation. But in this investigation, we will talk to students about the levels that consumers eat from. Primary or first level consumers eat organisms that make their own food. Secondary or second level consumers eat primary consumers. Tertiary or third level consumers eat secondary consumers. Quaternary or fourth level consumers eat tertiary consumers, and so on. Have students reorganize the food web. This time they're going to layer the organisms. Have them start with the producers at the bottom, then the primary consumers at the next level, and so on. Once students have completed their layered food web, discuss any discoveries that they may have made. For instance, they may discover that some organisms may eat from 2 different levels. This makes it a complex role. Have students come up with a way to indicate that an organism can play a dual role in an ecosystem. One such suggestion might be to either make another card for the organism and place it in the different areas it should be, or simply place the organism on the line in between the 2 levels. Discuss decomposers with students. Let students know that decomposers can be food for an organism, while at the same time serving as a cleanup committee for the entire ecosystem. So the easiest place for decomposers to fit into a food web would be along the side, as everything at every level eventually dies. Finally, in session 3, you want to reinforce the food web with the multimedia simulation, which can be found in the multimedia task tab. So as a do now for the next day, have students work in small groups and work on the Mono Lake simulation. Give them about 15 minutes on this activity. This activity just kind of reinforces students' ideas of the positions or the levels that organisms will belong to in an ecosystem. Next, have students complete the response sheet. This focuses on the arrows more so than anything. It helps students to demonstrate their understanding of how energy moves through an ecosystem using the arrows as indicators. And finally, you're assessing investigation 3 as well as investigation 4 by having students complete the mid-summative exam. This concludes investigation 4, Mono Lake Food Web.